but I thought the tax cuts that we got 2 years ago, as well as the improved economic performance, which everyone agrees has been up, were supposed to help us pay down our deficits. And a little bit we don't talk too much, though, is that our debt to GDP has actually fallen, hasn't it?
Well, we've got some temporary improvement, and you'll hear probably by the end of this fiscal year that when we get the September tax payment that the deficit comes under $1 trillion for the full fiscal year. But if you look forward, there's just an unending forecast for red ink, $1 trillion as far as the eye can see, over 4.5% of GDP. By any numerical metric, something that the United States should not be doing when we're at full employment, we're not facing a shooting war somewhere on the globe. So both parties are to blame in this. No one's taking this seriously, and it's, I think, the biggest risk facing the U.S. over the long term.
Why is that, Doug? I mean, we don't want to go too far down the MMT rabbit hole, for example, but there is sort of the counter view at this point that this level is not an issue for the United States. Why is it such a danger, in your view?
Well, I think it's best thought of as just sort of the termites eating at the foundations. This is something that is the government consuming funds that would otherwise be available to invest in the productivity of America's workers, invest in innovative technologies, capital goods, improve our competitiveness on the globe, and raise the growth rate of real wages in the United States. Those are core features that would be better for our future, and we're missing that opportunity. The reason no one seems to notice is that financial markets are not flashing bright red stop signs, and that's because the rest of the world is in comparably bad shape, and so the U.S. still looks relatively good. We can access global capital markets, and there is no sign of danger that politicians see. But I think it's an illusory situation. The danger is really there, and they should be paying attention.
Doug, there's obviously an indifference in Washington to deficit spending on both sides. And apparently there seems to be an indifference in the American electorate about it as well. People seem indifferent. What could possibly happen to shake everybody up? What is the potential crisis that could happen on the horizon that could make this an issue for everybody?
Well, I think there are two kinds of crises. One would be a genuine sovereign debt crisis, a Greece-Portugal scenario. I don't really think that's in the cards. I don't think that's the way this plays out. But if you look at the federal budget, it has two problems. One is this big mismatch between the revenue and the spending, and the second is the structure of it. The structure is that we are spending increasingly all our money on legacy programs, Medicare, Medicaid, Affordable Care Act, and not having any money available for the things our founders saw as the role of government: basic infrastructure, education, national security. And the electorate may actually at some point want to do something different in those areas. It's not crazy in a representative democracy for the next generation to say, hey, we'd like to have, say, a family leave proposal. And there's no money for that. And so a dissatisfaction with the politicians and their inability to meet the needs of their constituents, I think, is going to be the real trigger for this.
Hey, Doug, it's Rick Newman. If you look at the sources of revenue and you compare that to 2017, which was the last year before the tax cuts went into effect, you'll find that individual revenue from the individual income taxes is up, but revenue from corporate taxes is way down. And of course, supporters of the tax cut said, don't worry about that. It's going to generate all this economic activity and actually lead to more tax revenue. Is it? Can we now conclude that the tax cut has failed to do that?
No, I don't think that's the right way to read it. I mean, first of all, I do think the tax cut in the end was the right policy at the time. It should have been revenue neutral. That would have been much better. But the reforms we needed on the corporate side were really important for preserving the competitiveness of our big global successful companies. That's something both parties had agreed on, and it got done. And I think we should be pleased about that. The idea that we get better economic growth, I think, is real. We got much better economic growth. We've seen productivity growth rebound from below 1% to over 2% in recent data, and that's promising, and hopefully that will continue. None of that meant it was going to pay for itself. It was inevitably going to make the deficit bigger. It was inevitably going to add to the debt, and it had to be good enough to be worth that. Some people thought it wasn't. That's a fair judgment, but it was never going to immediately raise revenue. That's over the long term.
Doug, if you were the bipartisan deficit czar and they were coming to you with a few proposals that you would put in immediately to help correct the deficit and bring it back to something that's more normal, what would be those suggestions?
Well, I think to my fellow crazy people on the right, the reality is there's going to need to be more revenue. There's no way around that. And the best way to get revenue and continued economic growth, which is the second key part of the recipe, is to do the base broadening that didn't get done during the tax reform. There's still a lot of loopholes and special provisions that are sitting in the individual and the corporate code. That's a way to raise revenue. To my friends on the left, we need entitlement reform. There's no way around it. You cannot have Social Security growing at 8% a year when revenues are not going to grow at 8% a year. Same is true for Medicare, Medicaid, Affordable Care Act. So we need to get serious about entitlement reform. We need to get serious about broadening the base to get more revenue. And we have to stay focused on economic growth. You can't get any kind of real improvement without solid growth over the long term.
All right. Douglas Holtz-Eakin, American Action Forum President. Good to have you here on The Move.
Thank you.